Welcome to the Children's Tradition Podcast, where we introduce families to the poetic life. Hello, everyone. My name is Patrick Foss. I'm here with my wife, Amanda Foss, and we're blessed and honored to be here with Benjamin Lyda, who is the author of the Scriptorium Writing, which is a classical writing program. He's also a public speaker at the Scriptorium Writing and an education consultant. So, Mr. Lyda, thank you so much for joining us. We're so honored that you did.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's an honor to be with you today.
Yeah, we got introduced a few months ago. I think it was Ariel, my assistant, who brought your work to my attention because I kept telling people, oh, yes, someday, when we have the adolescent curriculum, we're going to do the Progymnasmata. Yeah. And so Ariel came to me and was like, hey, there's someone who's already done that. And it looks like he's done it in a way that really honors what we believe in with the poetic mode and everything. So I was so excited to get to meet you. We had a Zoom call, and I was just so inspired by your wisdom and heart with writing. You have a lot of experience, but more than just the experience of it as a teacher, you have really sought to look to the tradition for how we think about writing and how we approach it with our students in a way that is really living. And I think even reflective of Charlotte Mason and how she talks about things and esteemed just the path of the role of narration in that, and then also the progym exercises. So there's so much we're excited to talk to you about this week. But I also had the privilege of listening to you just last week at the Narration conference, and you quoted St. John Kronstadt, and I wanted to read this quote and just ask you about it because I felt like it was a perfect foundation to lay as we go into this conversation about narration and writing. St. John Kronstadt says on education, "We chiefly strive to enlighten the eyes of the student's understanding. Have you noticed that our heart acts first in our life, and in nearly all acquisition of knowledge, the heart sees certain truths before the mind comes to understand them?" So what I was hoping you could just open us up with is talk about what is this knowledge of the heart?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked because I'm still thinking about the answer to that question. This is definitely the inspiration for the talk that you heard at the Narration conference about knowledge of the heart. And St. John Kronstadt, in his meditations, talks a lot about this. It comes up a lot in his writing. The knowledge of the heart, though, the way I perceive it is it's a faculty of the soul that helps us to have knowledge of something by participation. And so that's as technical as I get. In a lot of ways, I suppose my work is a lot more metaphorical, maybe more poetic than, say, we might find a more technical definition of the kind of knowledge that we're talking about with some other writers, like, for example, Donald Cowan, for example. So, but I think what we're talking about when I'm talking about knowledge of the heart, I'm talking about something that we can know intuitively in its wholeness through participation. I think one thing that you mentioned in your questions is about, how is this similar to poetic knowledge and Dr. Taylor's writing? And I think I'm definitely influenced by that. And maybe in a lot of ways, it is the exact same thing. A poetic knowledge is the language he uses when he talks about not knowledge of poems, but a sort of spontaneous knowing that when the knowledge comes through the senses and then we've kind of recognized a thing and participate in it, and there's awe involved and all of these kinds of things. It's absolutely opposed to scientific knowledge, which is analytical and trying to have mastery over the thing. Knowledge of the heart or poetic knowledge is a lot more about receiving in humility the other, receiving it into yourself and getting to know it from this other kind of humble position, right?
Yeah, that's something I've been thinking about recently is, when you say the phrase poetic knowledge, it's kind of more confusing than helpful sometimes because people immediately lock it in the box of poetry. And of course, it's deeply connected to poetry, as we all know, but it means so much more than that in terms of that sensory, emotional, participational type of knowing. And so I just loved how you phrased it as that, as knowledge of the heart, because I think it is proper to say that you cannot have a proper, you can't be in the poetic mode properly without love. And love, of course, is in the heart. And so I think that really just that language you use, knowledge of the heart, is something that I'm going to certainly take with me as I move forward in using that to articulate more effectively what poetic knowledge is and what we're aiming for really is that opening of that inner eye of the soul to love and to see what is good in front of it.
And knowledge of the heart then implies that you love it, right? So the knowing of the thing, as St. Augustine says, right, to actually properly know something means that you love it, right? To love it means you know it, right? So there's this proper knowledge, and the idea of participation, which I think is such a rich word, especially when we're talking about poetic knowledge, the poetic mode, and what you're referring to there, this idea of engaging with it in its whole form, right? In its whole nature. And I think so much of when we contrast that of the scientific analytical mode, not only do you not participate with the thing, you can't participate with the thing because it's all cut up.
It's dead.
Well, that's very interesting. So it's not alive anymore. So maybe I'd love to flesh this out with you, particularly as I've gotten to just kind of know more of your work. Why is the analytical mode so attractive, even where I find it rather pervasive within a lot of classical institutions, that this seems to be the superior mode? I do see this idea of poetic knowledge talked about, but it seems like that is sort of viewed as this kind of inferior type of knowledge, something you graduate from, and we need to get to the superior mode, which is more the analytical. Why is that so attractive to many people in the modern
Yeah,
mode?
I think that's a great question, because I've noticed this tendency in a lot of classical schools also, a sort of kind of worship of the altar of reason. And I think there's a lot of history to that. There's an idea that reason didn't fall with the fall, right? This is very much in the age of reason and the Enlightenment. People continue to hold up reason as this kind of way of knowing the world that is not affected by the fall at all. I think that Charlotte Mason is really good to us in her explanation of the way of reason. And she explains that reason is what comes after knowledge, that reason is ultimately a defense for whatever we already believe, for what we already know. We then use reason to build scaffoldings to kind of help us structure those ideas that we already have. And so reasoning comes after. So we tend to get the cart before the horse in school when we overemphasize reason at the expense of this knowledge of the heart. This kind of intuitive knowledge or experiential knowledge or poetic knowledge, whatever phrase you want to use. Why do we still do this in the classical schools? I think we're just so much part of the atmosphere of our age. It's hard for us to separate ourselves from the tendency of the modern era. And I think that this whole movement, if we want to use that word, the classical schools, the classical books, all of these things, we're growing. We're still learning how to do this thing that's been completely forgotten. And a lot of what we've done in these schools is very similar to what we remember from when we were kids, or for what we think that our parents maybe did when they were kids, or maybe just a few more generations before that. We're uncovering things piece by piece. It's archaeological in a lot of ways. We find an old text and we kind of dust it off and we try to, breathe new life into it. But the tools that we have at our disposal are merely the tools that we learned ourselves growing up, which tends to be very much based on this sort of dialectical model of learning, question and answer, multiple choice, data-driven kind of education. So this is the tendency we have. And my concern has been in classical schools that I've observed, intimately with the students, what I mean is it's really easy to create pride in a student who has this kind of education. Now, we give them a book, like Crime and Punishment. Crime and Punishment is a result of a lifetime of suffering. Dostoevsky, I'm sure it took him, I don't know how long it took him, but it wasn't written overnight. And I'm sure there was rewrites and agony, a lot of himself put into this. It's considered one of the greatest novels. It's a masterclass of literature in the world. And we give this to students in high school. And we teach them a few kind of analytical tricks. They answer a few questions. Maybe they even write an essay. They get an A. And that A sends a message to them. You have mastered Dostoevsky, which is a really, really poor message to send to a student. They've mastered one of the greatest pieces of literature ever written in the world in a couple of weeks, maybe a couple of months if the school's generous with its time. So this is not really healthy for the soul. And so when I talk about education or knowledge of the heart, what I really am more interested in is than the intellect is the development of the soul, of the desires of the heart. And if there's any distinction between what Dr. Taylor says about poetic knowledge and what I'm trying to understand myself about this knowledge of the heart, as I'm calling it, is that The knowledge of the heart is something as a precursor to our knowledge of God. And to me, I see this as a kind of a natural process. Knowledge of the heart through the world. It's how we kind of participate in horse or flower. And it no longer is datum, like flower, but it becomes this specific flower, or this flower I love, or Zuzu's petals, if you know the reference. You know, it's something very personal, something very specific, very a part of yourself, right? You participate in it. Or what we know is just having children, you know, how much they enact what they see. They become the rabbit, they become the horse, they become the knight, whatever it is they're learning, they participate it through these actions. And so this is the kind of knowledge of the heart that I'm talking about, which sounds really identical to what Dr. Taylor's talking about. But I don't know if, and I could be wrong about this, he seems to really want to give a philosophical definition of this knowledge. And he talks about these stages of knowledge, the 4 levels of knowledge, moving from the poetic knowledge, and he goes to kind of a discursive knowledge and a scientific knowledge. He kind of goes up the scale. But I'm thinking of it a different way. I'm thinking of knowledge of the heart can also grow and progress, not toward scientific knowledge, but toward knowledge of God. Because anything that is worth our knowing is worth knowing in that open, humble spirit that I'm trying to describe, right? So as we participate in material things in this world, horses and flowers and dogs and all these wonderful things around us, we also then, as we grow older, we start to learn how to participate in friendships, in relationships with our parents and our brothers and sisters. And an analytical approach to relationship is doomed to failure. When we meet someone, we don't hand them a resume. When we meet someone, we don't, well, actually, maybe some people do this nowadays. Maybe they look them up and find all the information on their social media pages and feel like they know a person, which of course
it's an avatar world, isn't it?
Yeah, it's really weird, right? We're living this right now, that people think this is a way to know somebody, and you click a button, you are a friend. Hopefully not too many people actually fall into that, but I imagine there are some. But we obviously know, the majority of us know, at least intuitively, that that's not a real friend. That's not how you make a friend. It's not how you know someone. It is a lot related to love, and you brought that up earlier, and I'm glad you did. Because I'm struggling with this kind of concept of how knowledge and love are actually the same thing, right? And so this is where I think that this idea of knowledge of the heart is kind of turning, I hope, towards something a little bit more transcendent, because it's not just the sense perception perceives an object and it participates with the mind and the imagination, the memory, and we kind of get this recreation of the thing in our mind, right? That's a kind of a more maybe dry, sort of scientific-y definition of what I'm talking about. But I don't know. I feel like there's something else going on here. In the ancient Greek fathers, when they talk about knowing God, participating in the divine nature, as St. Peter talks about, they use the word nous. And a nous is usually translated as mind, but I think, the connotation of mind in our day and age as being the kind of computer of our bodies is not an accurate translation. And I like the translation heart better, because that's, again, in relationship, how we know things. It's how we know people, but ultimately it's also how we know God. Relationship is through love, and it's not through critical assessments of other individuals. When we approach things and people and books and God through the critical faculties of our brains, and I'll just use the word brain instead of mind, then we're actually not knowing a thing about it, right? As you said earlier, the thing is cut up on the table. It's ultimately dead when we put people and God into categories. But there should be a wildness and an understanding that the other is something that we can't tame, we can't control, and that we oughtn't put ourselves in judgment over them. And so this requires a very humble spirit of receptivity. And this is kind of what I want to understand, because it's so critical, not just for our studies, but for forming people, which is ultimately the goal of our education for all of our children. We want them to become people who are good, who love people and love God. But if we're always teaching them criticism, if that's all we're teaching them, if they've never actually just enjoyed a poem and let that get inside of them and bounce around for a little bit, right? Stretch its legs and walk about inside of them. If they've never had that experience with a poem, they're never going to learn to love it, right? It's the same thing with people, right? Until they've come over to your house and spent the night and spilled coffee on your favorite sofa, you haven't really learned to love the person, right? So in the same way, though, sadly, I think often we put God into these categories as well, and we try to systematize our understanding of them. But again, with the ancient fathers of the church, they would say, well, he's even beyond being. He's beyond being. I mean, we don't even have a category for that. And so God, in his mercy, in his love, he reaches out to us in his grace. And this receptivity that I'm talking about, this knowledge of the heart of things and people and God, is necessary for us to move closer with our relationship with God. It's something that we can only learn in prayer. And you're probably familiar with Simone Weil, although it looks like wheel.
Yeah.
They tell me it's Weil. And she has a wonderful essay on the proper use for studies for the Christian. And she explains the whole purpose. And I'm not sure we would want to take it quite this far, but maybe she's right. Something worth consideration. The whole purpose of all of our studies is actually to learn to pray, because it requires our attention. And this is something else that I think it's critical to understanding this knowledge of the heart, is that it's about our desires, our loves, eros perhaps. It's our attention, right? And so that attention that we want our children to develop with their studies is also the best way we form relationships. And I don't know, maybe this is too personal, but I have teenage daughters, 3 teenage daughters, and I hear frequently, you don't listen to me. And I'm learning, right? And but listening to somebody the way they mean, listen to me, Dad, is something that I'm obviously not giving them enough of. I'm not open enough just to receive, not to critique, not to help, but just hear and receive. And this is something I'm not good at, right? So I think that we have an obligation to our children, that when we're setting them up for their education, and this is, I've been claiming this for many years, is that the primary goal of all educators is to educate the heart. And so we have to think about what are the practical ways that we can educate the hearts of our children. We can't make them have good relationships with people that we want them to have, and we can't make them know God, right? We would love to be able to just click a button and make that happen. Well, we know that that's going to be on them. But what we can do is we can prepare the soil of their hearts so when the seeds are planted, right, there's good soil. That's seeds of grace. There's good soil for that to be nurtured and to grow into the kind of love that we want them to have for God.
It made me think about, particularly as you bring up soil, the idea of preparing the heart of our Lord's parable, right? Parable of the 4 soilers, right? Sowers, and where it's right, it's the 4th individual whose heart is prepared, right? It's the good heart that's ready to receive, and that's where the fruit abounds. Now, when you were bringing up the idea of mastery, right, particularly in pertaining to crime and punishment, it made me think of an interaction I once had with a seminary student who was studying the book of Job, and he said, I've now mastered Job. And I remember even thinking that you've mastered Job, the idea of the suffering righteous servant. That what is that, and what is that even, that the idea of mastery? So, because so much of what's tied to that mastery form, right, is that critical method. And what it creates is, I loved how you use the illustration of friendships. What it does is it actually really sabotages friendships. Because it creates a relationship of hostility with everything you engage with everything you interact with, because everything's somewhat defensive. Everything's in a posture of a shield and a sword, and somehow we think that that's more noble. Somehow, and almost like you have your bow and arrow, you have your arrows here, and I'm ready to shoot. But like I said, it creates this sort of tension with anything. So then what I find is it prevents you from actually entering into that very thing or that person, so you actually can't know it holistically. You can't, inevitably, it's fragmented.
Yes. Yeah, that's exactly right.
Well, I think even just in this world, exactly like you're saying, so much of we hear people talking about the lack of community, the lack of close relationships, and I wonder how much of this is just goes down to our orientation to all of life. That we're not from our earliest days, we are taught to analyze, to stand over, to memorize, to science everything. And yet that ultimately is going, to your point, distort the soul.
Yeah, well, and I'd love to ask you, because so much of what we're talking about, this receptive mode, the poetic mode, the heart, say the heart of knowledge, right? This type. How does that integrate with reason, especially in a society and a culture that is so bent on reason, particularly in the classical movement? We would say, right, what is so much about classical education about the cultivation, right, of wisdom and virtue, right? Wisdom seems to imply some sense of reason, right? Some sense of cognitive function and discernment that's applied. So what is the relationship with heart knowledge, the poetic mode, and reason? How is that integrated?
Yeah, I think Charlotte Mason does address this, and I think there's a version out there of her that I think she doesn't ever want anybody to be analytical or critical. I don't think that's accurate. Reading her work, she explains that these things actually just happen very naturally. With narration, this is the receptive mode. This is the poetic mode, that kind of entering into a thing without criticism and letting it penetrate into your imagination. That's what narration's about. Mm-hmm. So that's exactly that's the best way to start your education, is narrate, narrate, narrate. I'm a huge believer in that. And she'll explain, though, that, the body knows how to digest its food and the mind knows how to digest ideas as well. And this happens fairly naturally. Now, what she's saying, I think, is that you can't break that reasoning mode into these functions that you teach then as separate things. That, trying to compare and analyze and enumerate all these kinds of functions of the reason tend to happen almost simultaneously, or at least so quick, as quick as thought, that you can't tell where one begins and where the other ends, right? So I think she doesn't say it doesn't happen or doesn't need to happen. She's saying it just happens. It's very natural, right? We want the children, though, to start with an experience of wonder, right? Without that care, that attention, that love, that non-judgmental receptiveness to this other thing, we'll just say a poem, to this poem, right? Then anything that happens after that is absolutely pointless. In fact, maybe even damaging. So, I mean, the classic example, and again, this is maybe another reason to your earlier question, why do classical schools tend so much toward the more critical minds, thinking that this is the goal of all education? Well, they have accepted AP testing, for an example. A lot of them. And AP testing, what happens is you're handed a poem and you're immediately told to do a literary analysis and be able to write an essay and critique it, right? You're the master, and you've never actually let that poem walk about, stretch its legs, get inside of you, right? Mm-hmm. So it's a completely meaningless activity, first of all, and it creates either pride or criticism, all those things we've talked about, right? So we're going to start instead with narration, this receptive attitude. And then it's natural to say, oh, wow, I wonder if that is like, could it be also true that, or I remember I also read this thing and it said, that kind of reminds me of, and kids do this in narration. If you've had any experience with children in narration, they'll narrate beautifully, they'll narrate richly, they'll narrate copiously, and then naturally, some kid is going to say, oh, it's like when I went to my grandma's house, and et cetera, right? They start comparing. That's analysis. So it's not that we don't want children to analyze things. It's that we don't teach them how to analyze. Our role as teachers is to present them this feast of ideas. That would be Charlotte Mason's way to say it, right? A banquet of ideas of all the good things in this world that is worthy of their wonder and their attention, right? That's how we do it.
So it's the natural outworking, really the outgrowth of the thing once you're in it, that sort of is, right, the inevitable thing. Yes. Rather than, hey, we need to manufacture this. We need to program it. We need to systematize it, right? It just sort of happens that way, which is so much more, like I said, so much more natural and intuitive, to your point. So now you bring up narration, right, as such a key and central part of that. So please tell me, what is narration?
The mechanics of it is very simple. When reading to a child or looking at a picture or looking at a pine cone, you say, tell me everything that you noticed. That's the simplest way to do it. And if it's a picture or a pine cone, they'll start, oh, I see this, I see this, I see this. If it's a story, they'll start telling back the story from the beginning to end. And I coach teachers and I say, this is what narration is. You're asking the student to tell back everything they can remember with as much detail as possible, putting the story back in sequence even using the author's own language. So there's really just three things: as much detail as possible, putting in sequence, even using the author's own language. And it's not summary. It's not that we want them to just give a summary of what they heard. We literally want them to let that story get inside of them and for them to remember it. Now, it's not just a test of memory, although there's a lot of memory involved, but there's a lot of creation involved as well, because there's going to be some gaps. There's going to be some gaps in their remembrance. And so we create bridges between those things. I have this lovely book here I would love to mention because it's not mentioned ever in these discussions. It's called Unbinding Prometheus by Dr. Donald Cowan. Dr. Donald Cowan, he was the former president of the University of Dallas in Texas, which is just a fantastic, beautiful school. A lot of classical educators respect it. I have myself a master's degree from there. A lot of other people have master's degrees from there because, UD, that's the place, right? So it's a great school. And he was the president back in the heyday of the school back in the 50s and 60s. Well, he has this lovely book called Unbinding Prometheus. And a particular passage I love the most is this section he has called Imagination, Redundancy in the Act of Learning. And he's calling for more learning by synecdoche, not connecting all the parts for the students, letting their imagination do the work upon whatever object it is that they're studying. It says this: the primary imagination, which is what we might call poetic knowledge, or what I'm saying is knowledge of the heart, the primary imagination must function with a certain plentitude and waste, a redundancy that tends to scandalize educational administrators. But redundancy, we might consider, has its own benefits. Indeed, redundancy, rather than some such guide as Occam's razor, describe the essential path of imagination. The very concept of redundancy perhaps needs some rehabilitation in modernity, an age devoted to frugality and efficiency. And he spends the rest of this chapter talking about the need for redundancy and waste. I would call it luxury in education. But we as a culture do worship efficiency, as he discusses. And so teachers do this, scope and sequences do this, parents do this, because we want to just get them to get the point. But there's a sort of leisure that's necessary for the proper education of the heart. And that means a lot of narration. Narration is not efficient. It'd be a lot quicker to read the footnotes, to use a study guide and just answer a few questions and say, I have mastered it. But we're not getting to their imagination. We're definitely not getting to their heart through that kind of direct approach. The other day, I was just talking to my own children, the teenagers, and explained to them. I said, I noticed that when we force education, it doesn't work. Our hearts and our minds work a lot better through desire and not through this sort of like cramming it in there. There's no direct way to the heart, in other words. Right? There's no direct way to the mind. And so poetry and stories and narration are a very practical illustration of the kind of learning I'm talking about, right? There's going to be a lot of waste. People will feel I'm wasting time. We're not getting through the material. These are like the worst words you can use in education if you want to educate the heart. We have to get through the material. No, you need to make sure that there's enough time, leisure. What was the word we used the other day? You have to tarry with the work, tarry with the children, and let there be time for them to kind of just meet the book on its own terms, not with the critical eye. That takes time, just like meeting a person, right? My wife and I always felt like the best way to get to know new friends is say, hey, why don't you want to spend the night? So we have like adult sleepovers, every once in a while. Not very often, to be honest. But if you want to get to know someone, you really, really get to know them if you spend the night at their house. It takes time.
Take a camping trip together.
A camping trip, right? Or we take a friend, so we got an Airbnb together, right? These are the ways you get to know people, right? Just a quick catch up on some sort of chat device or something doesn't cut it. We have to have these long, wasteful moments, right? These are the best things in life. Anything that's wasteful is probably worth our time. Efficiency is kind of a heart killer.
Yeah, you exhorted us in the conference that we, like Christ, right? You were taking that word tarry from Christ, that he tarried with the disciples, and how we need to tarry with our students. And that word has just been on my mind ever since, because it's such a beautiful, I think it presents a beautiful image to the mind. Like you said, that are we willing to waste time on leisure, on actually spending time with the books? And that's something that, as much as the lesson plans of any curriculum are helpful as somewhat of a guide of, oh, here's a path that you can take to follow things. The thing that we find ourselves wanting to regularly remind everyone is the goal is not to get through the books. The goal is not to check the boxes that you read them, oh, well, we got through all the chapters, that were on the list, but did you tarry with them? Did you narrate them? Did you talk about it as a family? Did you enjoy it? Even just connected to what you were sharing earlier about the organic relationship between reason and the poetic participational way of knowing. Our oldest is in 5th grade, and it's been really interesting to me to see just in the past 6 months how I had embraced this philosophy of the poetic mode. And so I was never, pushing her into discussions about books. But within the past 6 months, she's just organically started to want to talk about books as she's growing older. Her mind is maturing. And it's just been a very natural process where suddenly it began in the summer. We were waiting for our baby. And so she watched Pride and Prejudice with me. And so then she wanted to read the book. So we watched all the different Pride and Prejudice versions out there. We read the book, all the things. And so she comes to me one day just out of nowhere and goes, Mom, I noticed that Kitty and Lydia have different vices, but what's the difference? I don't understand. And I, sat there calmly drinking my cup of coffee, but inside I'm freaking out because she's doing it. She's doing it. She's in love with the story. And now she's thinking about it but it is exactly like you've been saying, the type of way we think about something when we have gotten to spend time with it and love it first. It's not a mastery standing above. It's just when you love something, you do start to think about it. And so that is in the realm of analytical thought, but it's oriented in love. It's oriented in participation, and just, everything you're saying is so good.
Well, that was a perfect illustration of what we were talking about with your girl.
Yeah. So you wrote the Scriptorium Writing, which includes stuff about narration, but also goes into all the exercises from the Progymnasmata. So could you give us a little introduction to what is the Progymnasmata for someone who has not heard of that before? Start with that.
The Progymnasmata is literally the primary exercise, the proto-exercises. Prior to formal rhetoric in the ancient days, and not even that ancient, probably until the 1800s, this was the way that we trained students for rhetoric, through these exercises. There's 14 specific exercises, and they begin with fable, and they move all the way up through thesis. And so they're perfect preparatory exercises for what we hope our students to be able to accomplish at a high school level, for example, or college level, advanced composition or speeches or whatever you want to call it. Whatever the goals is. I know a lot of schools have a thesis project at the end. I've been a coach for some of these thesis projects, and they wanted their students to use all this classical language. Okay, you're going to start with the narratio, right? And then there's the refutatio, and they're using the Latin, so it sounds very classical, and that's good. I don't have a problem with that. But these students really were just educated in a very conventional way of writing essays. And so it was just kind of some Latin words put on what we already do. With conventional writing instruction, an introduction, body, conclusion, 3 points, etc. The problem that I've noticed with teaching writing is that, sure, students understand, I got it, introduction, body, conclusion. We're going to have 3 points in the body. We're going to have some evidence, and we're going to support that, and they get it. It's not hard. What's problematic is actually fleshing that out. How do you elaborate? How do you write what teachers called commentary, on their own sources? How do we do that? And that's something that's not taught in the conventional way. But the Progymnasmata is really a teacher of content, of creation. In other words, students who struggle knowing what to write, the Progymnasmata shows them topics, and these topics are ways that students can intuitively create content. So for an example, if I have, I've done this with fourth graders. Say, hey, we're going to do an encomium, which is a speech of praise, or in this case, an essay of praise. Well, how do you do that? Okay, Who's the character? I don't know. We're not going to praise Lydia. We got to think of somebody else. From Pride and Prejudice.
From Pride and Prejudice.
Yeah,
Lizzie.
we don't want to praise Lydia from Pride and Prejudice. That would not.
No,
so help me out. This is the first character on my mind.
Elizabeth, Jane.
Sure. So Jane, right? So we went it. Well, to think fourth grade. I want to stick with fourth grade here.
Do you want to do Wind in the Willows?
Yeah, sure. Let's do Wind in the Willows. I love Wind in the Willows. So let's praise Rat.
Mm-hmm.
Rat's congenial. He's friendly. He's forgiving. He's calm. Right. He's a good friend. Rat. The irony of that's really funny to me. Good friend, the rat. So we want to write a speech of praise for Rat. We want to incommonize him. Is that a word? Can we incommonize? I don't know. But we want to write a speech of praise for Rat, right? And so this would be a very difficult task if I said, okay, you need an introduction, a body, and conclusion, which if anybody tries that with an elementary student, stop right away. Please, please, please. Like that's not appropriate anyway. But I know that that's what's happening out there. But here's what you can do. What's one virtue that we could praise Rat for? By the way, just to carry on, I just want to piggyback on everything we've already been saying. The other thing is, if they haven't had the love of the Wind of the Willows yet, if they haven't experienced it the way we've been talking about it, this exercise that I'm talking about is not going to be fruitful. So I'm being consistent with everything I've been saying here, that comes first. And let them enjoy it. Let them love it. They're not writing as they go through it. They're writing at the end after they've had weeks and weeks to digest it, to narrate it, to enjoy it, to laugh. And then at the end, hey, who's your favorite character? Why? Is he great? Yeah. Give me one virtue that he demonstrates. Well, the rat, he's friendly. Good. All right. Can you narrate a story of him being friendly? Yeah, I could do that. Fourth grader. Can you define friendliness? Yeah. Putting in their own words, right? I'm not talking about dictionaries. Define it in your own words. Okay, I can do that. Can you give an analogy about friendliness? What's an analogy? Can you compare it with something else, like an animal? What would be it? Well, it's already an animal. Maybe that's confusing, but compare it to, I always say animals are easy. If I say, courage, what animal is courageous? That's easy for a kid, right? What do you think? Lion, right?
Lion.
Yeah. What animal is persevering? Maybe a camel or something, right? This is simple stuff. It's intuitive. So I've done this with fourth graders. They find that they can answer all my questions. They find it very intuitive, and I found students enjoy it. And when I first started teaching this at a small little school I was running, I did not have any kind of metric before letting kids come to the school. Some of my students came from homeschool. Some of them came from public school. But all of them enjoyed writing because they were able to understand it. It wasn't this big mystery. It wasn't tedious. It didn't involve outlines and making lists of words and things that are very analytical. It wasn't about breaking things into pieces. It's about wholeness of things. We're still dealing with one whole idea, Rat's friendly. We're just going to narrate a story. We're going to have an analogy. Maybe you can find testimony, a quote from the book that talks about his friendliness. These are all things that the student understands. And I'm not even teaching transitions. I'm not even teaching. Each of these is going to be one paragraph. I don't worry about all those kinds of things that we kind of obsess over. They just need to enjoy writing. And I love telling parents and teachers that the essay means an attempt. An attempt. And Montaigne, who coined the phrase, just meandered when he wrote on friendship, on perseverance, or whatever he was writing about on that day. And in fact, The Wind in the Willows is a great example, because I love the image of Rat and Mole rowing their boat up and down that river, right? That's the way writing should be. We roll down one way, and then we come to a dead end, and we row back the other way. We go up river, we go down river. We're going to explore a little, tributary. It turns out it's not a tributary, it's a cove. That's okay. We'll go back around the other way. You don't want to tip the boat. We do have limitations about writing, right? They can't do anything they want, but there should be a lot of freedom and flexibility in that process of discovery, which is really what good writing is. It's a process of discovery.
That's such a living way to learn writing. As you know, obviously, when we first met, I got to send you the children's tradition, and you got to kind of look at how I had mapped out a composition path, largely based off of Charlotte Mason and John Senior's work as well. And so for a family who chooses to possibly delay doing formal lessons in composition and sticks to only written narrations through 7th grade, how could they then integrate into your scriptorium writing in 8th grade?
Yeah, I don't think that's a bad strategy at all. I think it's fantastic. I have books level 4 and level 5 would be recommended for that situation. I wrote level 4 recommended for a 7th grader. But what I've done with the curriculum is I cycle through the exercises, the 14 exercises I mentioned earlier. So if you did happen to start at a younger level, say 4th grade, you're going to be introduced to fable, description, narrative, anecdote, for an example. And then the next level, you repeat those 4, and then you add a few more. So by the time you get to the book recommended for 7th grade, level 4, they're still going to begin with fable. They're going to start at the beginning again. They just spend less time on it. They're older. They can move more quickly. And a student who's had lots of experience with written narrations, they will actually, I believe that they'll rise up to this very quickly. I think it'll follow from that kind of work. But, I created the curriculum because not everybody is narrating every day. Not everybody is narrating. People who do narrate probably aren't narrating enough. And furthermore, we don't live in 19th century England like Charlotte Mason, whose dinner conversations were much more elevated than what we have been able to accomplish at our dinner tables. Well, I have 6 kids. My son's, he's 20, he's out of the house now. And sometimes we have success, but anybody with a large family like mine knows that dinner conversation can be a little chaotic. We don't have a grandmother from the 18th century to, wag her finger at us and remind us to, speak with proper grammar.
We relate. We have 6 children as well, and they're all small. And
Yeah.
so for us, it's just, can we get through it without anything breaking?
Exactly. That's success right there. That's what we want. You're doing great. You're doing great.
No, that's great. So I'm curious then, with this in mind, do you intend to write expand the curriculum to go into upper years, or are you envisioning that after they finish the progym in this maybe 7th, 8th grade-ish, maybe go another year if they start it later, that then they would transition into something else?
I'm actually working on a kind of an upper level curriculum right now. And so this is the challenge, though, with the upper level writing. The Progymnasmata, I think, serves very well for helping students create content. By the time you're writing at a high school level, and by the way, I have taught formally 4th through 12th grade in private schools, in hybrid schools, in charter schools, in public schools, in homeschools. I have kind of seen the whole range of writing abilities. So I think it's been a unique experience that I've had that's given me a kind of the bird's eye view of what I know that the 4th graders should be doing so that they can get to 12th grade, because I've done it all. In any case, by the time you get into high school, the kind of writing you want students to be able to do, you do want them to be able to write something a little bit more critical and academic, because that's just kind of how it is, and that's okay. But what the Progymnasmata gives them is it gives them the ability to write content, to fill in the commentary, to elaborate upon an idea. For an example, if it's something like, okay, so what are the vices of Lydia, right? And then you come up with, she has this vice, this vice, this vice. Okay, well, now let's elaborate on that. Can you narrate a story about that? Yeah. Can you give an analogy about that? Yeah. Can you define that? Yeah. So we have all these topics that the student can then use to help create that content for that writing. So the writing becomes a lot more alive, a lot more interesting, and we're not being reductionists and only using a quote as the only kind of evidence. There's other kinds of evidence. A narration is an evidence, right? An analogy is a kind of evidence. It's anecdotal, but it still helps move forward the argument. And this is something that a progym will teach, that there's other kinds of ways of knowing that can be incorporated into this upper level writing. So in any case, the challenge, though, is that when writing, if you're not writing from ideas and you're just filling in blanks, you're not writing, and it's not going to be good anyway. Again, this follows everything we've been saying. If a student, like you've described your daughter with Pride and Prejudice, has had that experience with Pride and Prejudice and now has interest enough to they want to be critical about it, right? And she's capable of writing that critical essay, right? It required a whole lot of experience with one text. So you can't write a curriculum with excerpts. Students have to be writing from whole works. And I've used excerpts in the Scriptorium Writing out of necessity. But in the high school level, that just doesn't cut it. And so what I've been doing is creating kind of a writing curriculum and reading guide. So the first one I've created is for the Odyssey. And in the Odyssey, it'll be a way to help read through the Odyssey. And then it will have written assignments, exercises, and essay assignments that should be driven by ideas that will help both the interpretation of the Odyssey, but also the process of learning to write. Those two things really just have to be working together. And the other problem with high school is that, most high school teachers and most high school programs, a lot of homeschool families, they might want to, outsource their literary studies in the high school level, maybe, or maybe they have particular books they want their students to read. So I can't choose a curriculum for everybody. So it's been kind of a work of, okay, what are the books that I think a lot of people are going to want to read? How can I give them interpretive tools to help them think about it, to drive them toward ideas? And I'm definitely not using any kind of reading guide questions. That's not what we're looking for at all. It's more like I'll have like an introductory essay on a concept that will help interpret. Well, with the Odyssey, I'll just get to it. In the Odyssey, the way I'm looking at it is that it's a story of healing. Odysseus has been wounded by his time at war, and so is his family. Right? I mean, this is it's classic post-traumatic stress. Right after he leaves Troy, the first thing he and his crew does is they sack the Caconians. They go into that island, and he's still in the mode of Ares, and he kills and he takes the women and he takes the food, and they kill people, and there's no difference between the men in war and the men now coming home. They're still in a warlike state. And obviously this is very destructive to the people around them and also to his crew, but also to his soul. And so why does Odysseus have to spend 10 years getting home? Because he has to heal. And you can kind of it's really interesting because you could see all of these different islands he lands at, like the island of Helios when he's told, don't eat this calf, right? I mean, don't eat the cattle of Helios, right? I mean, he's learning to fast. He's learning to curb his indulgences and his passions. And so everywhere he goes on his trip, and he learns a little bit more wisdom and a little bit more wisdom, and he's healed of these harms that have been done from him because of what he has done and what people have done to him in these wars. And until he's healed, he's not able to come back home and cleanse his house, right? He has to be healed and become the king he's supposed to be. If he comes back in his warlike state, he's no different than Polyphemus the monster. And so I've kind of juxtaposed throughout the little essays that help guide the reading. I've juxtaposed the monster and the man. The goal for Odysseus is to become a man and to shake off the harm that's been done him from war, where he's become just like Polyphemus, somebody who just takes and kills and indulges in the. And there's a really specific part of that chapter on Polyphemus where it explains that the Cyclops are those who live unto themselves. They have no counsel and they do not eat bread, which is so fascinating. Like, why does it matter that they don't eat bread? Well, they're hunter-gatherers. They don't need the community. They don't have to submit themselves to one another because they don't have farms. They don't have a market to trade in. They don't need laws. So each Cyclops is a rule unto himself. Well, that's exactly what Odysseus is when he leaves the war. So he can't come back to Ithaca and righteously cast out the suitors and reestablish his kingship. He has to be healed. So that's kind of the concepts that I want to introduce, just to point out a few things in the reading of the Odyssey. And then throughout there, we're going to give writing activities, and we take those topics of invention introduced in the Progymnasmata, and we elaborate them. They get a little bit more technical. So for definition, instead of just, hey, come up with a definition, which a fourth grader can do, or if you ever look in a dictionary, you should use the 1828 reprint, the reprint of the 1828 Webster's Dictionary, which I think is now available online, but I don't know. I'm a little dubious if it's the same. I don't know. Maybe it is.
As long as it's allowed to be online.
That's right.
Yeah. I love what you said, though, particularly as you described the Odyssey. There's such a beauty there that it's a journey to healing. Particularly as I hear the Odyssey, of course, journey, man's life journey. But really, it's a journey to be healed, which is really the goal of education, right?
Yeah.
It's healing of a mind, healing of a heart, healing of our loves. So they'd be properly and rightly ordered. That is the goal of what we pursue, right? Which is this heart knowledge. But I'd love to ask you: is there potentially any pros and cons here in terms of an early introduction to these exercises, particularly around the third grade versus waiting until eighth grade?
Yeah, I think that's a fair question. I would say that if you are reading voraciously, and if you are narrating constantly, and if your dinner conversations are rich and beautiful, and you're turning off the radio, and you're turning off, does anybody listen to the radio anymore? I don't know. I do, in the car. Turning off the radio, and you're not watching movies, right? In other words, if you're creating a landscape that's rich with language, then a student probably doesn't need any additional help. They, I think, as Charlotte Mason said, will very naturally acquire their own voice and their ability to have, facility with language and vocabulary, et cetera. They'll get it. And then at that point, if it's around 7th or 8th grade, as you guys recommend, I think it'd be appropriate to give them some additional tools to help them along with that kind of reasoning process, right? And help them kind of think about some different ways to order it. And one thing that's very distinct in I don't see this anywhere else. I give some suggestions for an arrangement, first do the definition, then do this. But throughout the curriculum, I'm constantly reminding them, but use whatever order makes sense to you, because outlines are only helpful as far as they are able to help us order the ideas we have. But I've talked to my own students about this that I still teach writing to, and they say, well, yeah, I've tried that other curriculum. And, they told me I had to have 8 sentences, and then I had to stretch out my idea across 8 sentences, or I had to cram my ideas into 3 paragraphs. So that's not what we're looking for. So in any case, I think the pro of doing that is the kids are going to have a wonderful vocabulary. They're going to have a relationship with tons of great literature. And then when they was about 13, 14 years old, they're very naturally going to begin more and more to have an analytical frame of mind. And then it seems appropriate to introduce some additional tools. On the other side, I think the most of us probably don't have an atmosphere that's rich enough with language. I know my household doesn't, to say that, oh, okay, I don't need to do anything for their composition and instruction. I find that, most of us do need some instruction because we don't have that rich 19th century, where Charles Dickens is entertainment, where friends will sneak books, right? And they get in trouble for reading too late. That doesn't happen anymore. Well, actually, some people may be reading too late. I know that does happen with some of my kids. You guys go to bed, put that book away. But it's not Dickens, though. It's not bad stuff, but it's not Dickens. But this is a different atmosphere. It's a different world we live in. And just anecdotally, and this was many years ago, I've never had a DVD player in my car, but one time I borrowed my dad's, and he had a DVD player in his car. And I put in a DVD of a popular animated film from the time. And it just doesn't cross my mind until this moment where I'm driving, not looking at the pictures and only hearing the sound. And so here's the dialogue. Hurry up, get out of here, quick. It's I don't even think there's 3 words strung together, but we spend a lot of our time in entertainment in this mode. And that is not going to facilitate the kind of language we want them to be able to use when they're writing. So I find that most of us need a little additional help and structure to help guide us toward that way we want them to go. Mm-hmm. But it'd be better if we were in a rich environment of language. It would be better.
Well, and I wonder how much of this might have to do with even what our end goal is in terms of, John Senior, it was really interesting to me when I read his idea of a school, or Restoration of Innocence, it goes by both titles, because he basically only advocated for written narration through high school, even at his adolescent program. But I think that was oriented around the fact that the IHP and John Senior as a teacher taught the progym at the college level, because they were dealing with students who were so malnourished spiritually, so their cultural soil was so depleted that they couldn't even in college go beyond that. They had to go and do the progym at that level because of where those students were at. And so I think what I'm hearing you say is we all kind of have to self-evaluate and consider, all right, what is the cultural soil of our home? How are we doing with the language and the literature? And like you said, is it a balanced approach to movies, things, or are we just binging stuff and that's their main diet is dumb books, dumb shows, all this stuff.
It's hey, run, go.
Right. And even I think, I wonder, let's say somebody was to come in, maybe they were in public school and then in 5th grade, they come in and they're learning about this type of philosophy of education. And suddenly it's oh no, I'm so behind. And I'd be curious what you would want to say to them. Cause I feel like what I'd want to say to them is take a few years in that participational mode, like heal a little bit from that systematized approach. And then in a few years, maybe you don't start the scriptorium till 9th or 10th grade, but then you've done some of the healing necessary to be prepared for it. But I don't know. Do you have a different perspective?
It's like they need a type of rehab first before they can start doing it.
Oh, I love this language we're all using, because I'm thinking of Odysseus again, healing, right? We all need that time to heal, to go through a few And hey, by the way, you know where Odysseus spent the most amount of his time? It was on Circe's island for 7 years. Circe's island was paradise. He wasn't suffering. But that's where we find him, and he's crying, sitting on the beach every single day. And it puzzled me. I said, well, what's he learning here? What is he purging from his soul in this? And I realized that in paradise, until you're in paradise, you haven't dealt with the stuff inside, because it's so easy to blame your circumstances. And so for 7 years, Odysseus is sitting on the beach, and he's finally like, I've lost my crew. I've done these things. My wife is far, far away. My son's growing up without me, and he has to deal with himself in this moment. So we all definitely need some of those kinds of leisurely times of healing, for sure. I think also your comment about discerning the cultural soil of your own home is a good plan. And so I don't want to lay down any hard principles here. Especially with homeschoolers, I think the beauty of homeschooling is that you don't have to put your child on the conveyor belt. Our system of first grade, second grade, third grade, they should be at this level at this time, is completely erroneous. And as a homeschooler, you have that privilege of going at the pace that's appropriate for that child, right? And also, those of us raising children, probably everybody listening to this, is we know this just developmentally. We see our kids, leaping forward in one area of their life and lagging in another, and then it flips. Or maybe they move forward in one area and then they go back 2 steps a few weeks later. So there's no synchronous development. There's no linear development of children. And so in their education, it's the same thing. So I'm not going to lay down a rule for how much time that would take. I will share one anecdote with you. Running my little school, St. George, in Denton. And like I said, we would allow anybody to come in. We had a girl come in she was a 5th grader. She was from public school. And I'll tell you some of the things that characterized her. One, she had complete test anxiety. She was completely terrified of speaking in class. And we narrated every class every single day. Okay. It was 3 days a week. And she also she had chicken scratches for handwriting. Right. And, from all appearances, there's probably some challenges at home. Well, I would say that when she came September, by December, she was pretty comfortable at the school. She had done a lot of healing. For her, with the narration, I'll tell you what we did, because she was terrified to say a word. And so I pulled my teacher aside. I said, look, all you have to do, and anybody can do this. All you have to do, if you're in a group of people, and say, I'm going to call on you first tomorrow. And I just want you to say one word that you remember. One, just it. That's it. No big deal. And so my teacher, she pulled the girl aside. Hey, I'm calling on you first tomorrow. Because normally I told the teachers calling kids randomly. Don't let them raise their hand with narration, right? Everybody's being held responsible. But in this case, I said, tell her you're going to call her first. She did. The girl was able, of course, to say more than one word. She said 2, 3, 4 words. And she did this for a couple of days in a row, let her have the first word. And pretty soon she realized, because I also train, and this is the same for all of you parents using narration, don't correct narrations. And the anxiety, I tell parents and teachers, don't even say good job. Because did you say good job to every single narration every time to every kid that you're teaching to narrate? So if you have like a 9-year-old and an 8-year-old together in the same class at your home, and you want them to narrate, and you said, oh, good job, 9-year-old. Did you say it to the 8-year-old? They're going to immediately, they're siblings. They're going to compare each other. It's going to create that tension. So I tell teachers and parents, I say, just smile. And you can nod. I know my camera is a little funny there. I don't know what it looks like on the screen, but you told me earlier it looked like I was getting eye test.
That was awesome. If I can make a GIF out of that, I think I will. No, well, that is so rich and and very just practical. I mean, even just I think of different ways we can implement and incorporate that. And so all of this has been so satisfying, Benjamin. So thanks so much. Where can people just find more of your work?
You can find me at scriptoriumwriting.com. I'd be happy to receive your email at benjamin@scriptoriumwriting.com. And I'm going to make a big announcement here, which I'm pretty excited about, that we are actually this week launching Living Classical, which is going to be kind of our consulting arm of Scriptorium Writing. And so you can, although the website's not that great yet, you can find us actually at livingclassical.org also. Brand new website. It's not officially launched, although I think it is published. So you could just also check us out there and see how we grow.
Wonderful.
That's exciting.
That's exciting. Thanks for announcing that. Well, thank you so much for coming on. We're so grateful that you did.
Thank you so much. God bless you.